if there's something you really want, don't be afraid to ask because you never know the answer and you will regret it forever if you just didn't take that shot. So, always take your shot. The worst thing that can happen is somebody says no. And if they say no, you'll get over it fast. But if you don't even try, then you know the answer is no from not even trying, and you'll always regret it.
Hey, everybody, welcome to the Going Beyond the Deal podcast. Today, I have my guest, John Sutton. John Sutton is the CEO of the Wine Group, one of the largest wine companies in the world. He oversees a portfolio of iconic brands, including Franzia, Cupcake, Benziger, and many others that have shaped how consumers experience wine across generations. Under his leadership, the company has navigated major industry shifts, executive strategic acquisitions, and continued innovating in an industry that is both ancient and constantly evolving. John's career path is also very unique. Before leading one of the largest wine companies in the world, he built a career in law, served in government, and even worked as a staffer in the White House. Today, we're going to talk about his journey, the future of the wine industry, and what it really takes to build brands that scale and last. John, welcome to the show.
Great. Thank you for having me. That's a very kind introduction.
Well, listen, before we get into the wine industry, I really like to start with the person behind the title. So, can we talk a little bit about where did you grow up? Where did you come from, John?
Yeah, I grew up in San Francisco. So I'm born and raised, probably one of the few native San Franciscans you come across these days with people kind of coming and going.
Very cool, very cool. So, where did you end up going to college?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, grew up in San Francisco. I went to college in Philadelphia at the University of Pennsylvania. Then after that, as you mentioned in the intro, after college, I moved to Washington, D.C., and was fortunate enough to be a staff assistant in the first term of Clinton's White House in the early 90s. And then ended up moving back to California around 1997. Got tired of the cold. I don't know how you guys do it, back east and
I'm just very jealous. I'm very, very jealous of this. Now, listen, I think as a White House staffer, that's not really a typical path to becoming a wine CEO. So can you dive into a little bit about, how that happened and then maybe some of the lessons that you learned that you took into the rest of your career?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think I probably have the most circuitous route or kind of unorthodox route to becoming a CEO that you might ever come across. And so, as you mentioned, early in my career, I often tell people I probably peaked in my 20s, at least, kind of comparing to what I'm doing today. But I kind of lucked into a role in the White House when I graduated college. I got accepted into an internship program there and moved to Washington, D.C., thinking I'd be there maybe for only 90 days or so, or however long this internship
And where
lasted.
was the internship? What was it for?
It was at the time when they were trying to pass healthcare reform. So they had formed this kind of like centralized communications room and department around trying to pass the healthcare plan. But the person in charge of that was the deputy chief of staff of the White House and his team. And coincidentally, kind of halfway through there, someone in his office went out on maternity leave. So they asked me if I wanted to sub for this person in the deputy chief of staff's office, and she never came back. So ended up getting hired permanently into the office, ended up staying 3.5 years and It was great. I was just a staff assistant to the deputy chief of staff, but I was right in the chief of staff suite with the chief of staff, who was Leon Panetta at the time. The vice president was right next door. The Oval Office was, kind of 15 feet down the hallway. So I really had a front row seat to just visually kind of to everything, which was pretty amazing when you're in your young 20s.
Very cool. I mean, so is there any lessons that you took from that experience? I mean, it was Clinton and Gore, I'm thinking
Yeah,
at the time.
exactly.
Yeah. Were
Yeah,
they
that's right.
both pretty friendly? I mean, did they give you time? Did you learn anything from the both of them?
Now, I certainly didn't spend a lot of time with them. I mean, at my level, but just the little time that I got, the thing with Clinton that always amazed me is he had just this amazing ability to connect with people and know exactly what to say at the right moment. And I would see sometimes how, speech writers would hand him a speech before a big
Mhm.
talk, and he would look at it, tear it to shreds, jot down, four notes, four bullet points, and then just go out there and speak for, 50 minutes and kind of wow the crowd. Just an amazing ability to do that. But in terms of lessons, there were several lessons I learned. One thing, my boss, so I mentioned the deputy chief of staff, for better or for worse, he was a workaholic. He grinded from he was probably in 7:30 every morning, probably there to 11 o'clock at night every day, 7 days a week, literally. And I've just always maybe I'm not that quite that bad today, but I've always carried that lesson with me that at the wine group, we try to outwork our competition.
Yes.
We grind really, really hard. We don't pretend we're the smartest in the room at any point, but I will guarantee we are always the most prepared and the ones that always work the hardest. So that was really a big lesson. Probably the second one as well that I tell people all the time within the wine group, a lot of our younger folks, and this isn't, 100%, it's more related to politics, but I think it's applicable in the business world as well. I had somebody pulled me aside one day and gave me some great advice. And they said, be nice to everybody on the way up because they're going to pass you on the way down. And I've always taken that with me and reminded that because I'm even in the business world, I'm a true believer that networking and who you know gets you so much farther in that. Plus, I've seen so many examples of people once they hit their 40s or so, maybe people that used to report to them, they're now reporting to who in that relationship, switches. So I tell people all the time when they're younger, be nice to, everybody around you because you never know if you're going to need them down the road.
It's so funny that you say that. I've had that experience my whole life. I just wrote my first book. I have an unconventional upbringing into banking and becoming a managing director of an investment bank. And I literally started out as a teller at a retail bank. And I remember the commercial bankers that would come in and the CEOs, the executive suite would be so nasty to the lowly staff that there was. And when I finally started moving up in the world, that is the one thing I was super intentional with, is just being so kind to everybody that was there, because you never know eventually who you'll be standing shoulder to shoulder with, but they'll be with you on the way down. I've never heard it put that way. That's a very good one to remember for me.
Yeah, Washington is famous for, whether you're a party in power one day and the next party, or somebody within there is really the hot person, but 90 days later, they're not anymore. So that's always a lesson there. But like we said, I think it's applicable in all of life.
For sure, for sure. So, I mean, we started talking about the wine group and what you're doing there. How did you finally make that transition? So, I mean, you practice law as well, I think. And then how did you eventually get into the industry? When did you take me from leaving the White House, and then what was next, and then how did we end up at the wine group?
Yeah. So after the Clinton won in 1996, so I was trying to decide whether to stay or leave. I had applied to graduate school, both business school and law school, and I decided I was going to leave because I was worried that if I didn't leave then, I'd continue working. Suddenly, I'd find myself maybe in my young 30s, and it's just much harder to go back to graduate school at that point in life. And so I couldn't decide whether to go to law school or business school. So I ended up doing both. I did a joint
As one
program.
does.
uh, and when I came out of school, then at that point, I decided I wanted to practice law. And so I became a M&A and VC lawyer. And coincidentally, the very first mergers and acquisitions deal I got assigned to was the wine group buying a brand called Glen Ellen from Diageo. And probably the third deal I got assigned to was the wine group buying a brand called Kincannon from the Wente family. So that was kind of my first exposure to the industry and to the wine group itself. But like I said, it was more on the M&A side. Not I didn't have sort of specific wine industry experience. And then you probably fast forward 6, 7 years, so about 2007. This is another like story I tell a lot for folks. So I'd reached that point where I thought I was going to make partner at a law firm, but I didn't really want to do that. I had kind of realized I didn't really want that kind of lifestyle, and I'd gotten kind of bored, even though I enjoyed M&A deals. I really wanted to sink my teeth into a business rather than going transaction to transaction. And the wine group at the time had never hired a lawyer before, never had any internal counsel. And I'm not a super forward person or super aggressive. And so I was real hesitant to reach out, even though that's where I wanted to go work. But one day I told myself, hey, if you don't reach out to the CFO and at least tell him you're interested in working there and that you're looking for a job, you'll always regret it. So I got up the guts, I called him, and he said when I mentioned to him, he said, it's funny you should say that. We've been thinking about hiring a lawyer, and in fact, we've talked about you for every quarter for probably 2 years. And I think if it wasn't my getting up the guts to call and just asked, it never would have set things into motion. So I always tell people all the time, if you really want something, you've got to have the guts to go for it and do it. Otherwise, you always kind of regret it.
So now was the CFO like running a lot of the process in terms of acquisition and stuff? So he
He
kind of
was.
needed someone to be kind of next to him to be able to help him through it. You had gained a lot of experience from running these transactions, obviously now understanding, kind of what it was. So you had all the tools and you were ready to go into it. You just needed to get the guts to ask. So I love that kind of thing. That's a big takeaway today from all the listeners. I mean,
Exactly. I just told us, what's the worst case? They'll say, no, we're not ready, or we don't want a lawyer internal. The funny thing is, I remember interviewing with the CEO at the time, and he took me out to lunch, and he said to me, I just have one question for you. And I said, what? He said, if I hire you, will you multiply? And I was like, "What do you mean by that?" He said, "Well, my experience is when you hire a lawyer, they tend to multiply, and suddenly we'll have 4." I said, "No, no, I promise I won't multiply."
it's too funny. Too funny. So let's shift into the wine industry. There's been a lot of headlines about wine, slowing down. From your vantage point, what's really happening right now in the industry?
Yeah, there are a lot of different dynamics going on right now. Some of them are cyclical. Things obviously like the economy, interest rates, inflation, those are all really impacting the industry. Tariffs, kind of you name it. And there's no question, wine is unfortunately a discretionary item. It's not an essential item. So as consumers have been pinched and strapped a bit income wise, that's had an impact on the industry. But I'm actually more in the camp. There are a lot of structural issues going on as well. Wine has essentially premiumized for the better part of 15 years. And while that's not a bad thing, and the wine group has certainly participated in that as well, that has been part of our strategy. But it has had real consequences as well. Wine has essentially become an unaffordable luxury and really marketed to call it the 1%. And what's really growing is wines above $20, and everything kind of below $20 is struggling. And that is really below $20 where all the size, scale, economic impact of the industry really is. And so it's been struggling in this sort of economic backdrop to really also kind of attract the new consumer as well, the younger consumer. Wine's kind of lost its on ramp to the younger consumer because it's just become too expensive for so many people to afford.
I think about that a lot. And as someone that's relatively health conscious, and, what I'm seeing in various industries, you know, people don't want to spend money on certain things, right? But they're always going to spend money on socializing, right? Because they need to have that outlet. But wine's kind of a healthier, alternative to me. A good glass of red wine is something that feels healthier to me. Most people that I know that, I've run a fitness company in the past before, our clients would always say, "Okay, I'm willing to give up the cake. I'm willing to give up the candy, but I just want a nice glass of red wine on a Saturday or with my steak. I want to have that wine." I before we jumped on, I told John yesterday I did a ton of manual labor, and my reward was a nice steak and a glass of red wine. I mean, how do we start marketing that to the people? Because the way I look at it, a nice $15 bottle of wine, that's relatively affordable. I mean, that's the same price as going to the movies. And for me and my wife, we don't even go out to dinner as much anymore because we can cook it better at home. I'd rather go out and buy a package of steaks, get a nice bottle of $15 to $20 wine, and then create a really, special night around that. I mean, how do we get people to start thinking about that more?
Yeah, look, I love that scenario. That describes me as well. And wine is a naturally made product. It's obviously farmed versus a lot of other products that are formula based. And I think wine just hasn't done a good enough job, telling that story that you're describing, that it is naturally made. It is generally low in calories. It has some natural sugar, but there's not sugar added to it in any way. And, I think we're starting to do that as an industry. So we're not at this point on the ground floor, but we've been very late to sort of tell that story. And you're right. Wine is kind of part of a healthy lifestyle, kind of drunk in moderation, really should resonate with more and more consumers as well. And we just need to, as an industry, do a better job of kind of getting that story out there. I think so much of the industry in the past has been marketing with, leading with either high scores or vineyards stories and terroir and things like that, and it's just not resonating like it used to. People just aren't interested in that.
And it's funny because the story that I just told you is the story that my parents told me. I mean, my parents said, when we were young, we had no money. We would go out, we could get a bottle of wine, we would, get a steak. It wasn't filet mignon, it was a cheap steak. And we literally would sit there and we'd make a nice meal together and we'd play badminton in the backyard. And that was like our date night. And so I'll just put this out to you there. My wife and I are happy to shoot a commercial for you to bring that back to the world.
I
We
may
will
take
never
you up on
complain about that.
that.
Yeah. Because I think it's like in a world where everything's kind of getting squeezed, you kind of create your own date. You get your own date night and you could do it very inexpensively. Because I'll tell you, these days I go out to dinner with my wife and my daughter, we're spending $150. And every time we come back, we're going, ugh, we could
Yeah.
have made it better ourselves.
Yeah, I mean, it's crazy. I mentioned earlier about, wine hasn't done a good job about attracting the younger consumer. I see it with my own kids who I have twins that are, 22, almost 23. And if I take them out to dinner and I order a glass of wine for them, they will drink it fine, but and then they'll like it. But if they're on their own, they do not go anywhere near wine, mainly because it's intimidating to them. There's so many different types. They don't know what they like and what they don't like. And when the industry is entirely premiumizing, it is really hard for somebody who's is either younger and doesn't have the money or has the money but is unsure to sort of spend, whether it's $30 on a bottle of wine, or as you mentioned, you can't go to a restaurant and get a glass of wine for under 15, $20 anymore. People really struggle buying something they don't know if they'll like the taste or not and what it is at that kind of price. And so I mentioned earlier, we've lost that on ramp for those kind of consumers to just experiment and figure out what they like and don't like. And that's really what we're working on ourselves and as an industry.
So is there anything that you guys are doing different you're seeing? I mean, like I know like packaging innovation, whether it be boxes and cans, where it might be a lower barrier to entry than buying that big bottle. I mean, like is there anything like that working?
Yeah, no, without question, the Tetra packs are very popular right now, and so we're certainly participating in that along with a lot of other folks. What's working a lot, kind of with the younger generation is not traditional wine. Things like fruit flavored wine. It's an interesting trend. We talked a little bit earlier about sort of drinking less, but maybe spending more to enjoy yourself on a bottle of wine. We see, particularly at the lower end and with the younger consumers, a dynamic of actually very high alcohol is actually selling well as well. But whereas you and I may have, when we were younger, we would go spend $30 for a big jug of vodka or, a 24 pack of beer or something, looking for, what could we get the biggest size of at the lowest price. They're actually going in and saying, I've got $7 to spend. What's the best bang for the buck can I get for $7? And a lot of times that's brands like Beatbox, Buzzballs, some really, really high alc stuff. And so we see some really interesting trends where low alc and no alc are really popular. Really high alc is popular. And then every alcohol, kind of call it from that 4% to 14%, is actually declining. It's kinda interesting.
Yeah, that is very interesting that it's so, like, so on both sides of the spectrum.
Yeah.
The one thing I was just thinking about, you just made me think of a story on my own. My father-in-law is from Italy, first generation, big wine guy, and if I ever ordered a glass of white wine, he'd look at me funny, like, "Really?" You know? But but I remember being in Philadelphia with a friend of mine who was a buyer for some of the major hotels in the city. So he knew wine really well. And I remember it being 100 degrees outside. We go into a bar and he goes, "So what are we drinking?" And I was like, "You're the expert at this. You order it for us." And he orders me a glass of cold white wine. And I looked at him like, "Ugh, this is not for me." And it's the first time I ever had an Abarino. And I was like, "Oh my God, this is so refreshing." But it would have been the last thing that I would have ever had the chance to order. And that's the thing now is I think that most people are I think it's more about the experience, right? Like the non-alcoholic beer market is great now. I'm a huge fan of it because I enjoy the taste of it. But at 44 years old, I don't feel like I got hit by a shovel, the next morning after I drink a couple of them. But I really think it's the experience to just get people more opportunities to, kind of try these different things at a lower barrier to entry.
It's a great, great point. I was in Spain this past fall, and I was just blown away that, every curbside cafe you pass by 11 a.m. is packed with people.
Yeah.
And, even on a Tuesday night, Wednesday night, every restaurant is packed. And wine and beer is like $4. It's cheaper than water in a lot of places. And it just struck me that culturally, I think Europe, or at least places like Italy, Spain, have kind of come out of COVID and returned to a lot of kind of the pre-COVID socialization, and wine and beer and even spirits are back to sort of being part of everyday cultural life, and is very affordable, tastes just fine. And to your point, if you order something that's $4 and you don't like it, no big deal. You just order something the next time. Whereas in the US, we're still very much, I think, coming out of COVID, everybody's on their phone. People aren't going out like they used to, not to bars, not to restaurants. Not everybody's returned to the office, and everything has just become more and more expensive. And yeah, it's a real barrier that I would just love to see us somehow culturally kind of get back to that socialization, a lot like Europe has kind of pre-COVID.
Now you just made me think of it. The last time I was in Spain, I remember going to a restaurant and it was, I'm going to butcher this. It was like vino de semana, right? The wine of the week. And it was like €10. And then you could sit down and they'd give you some, my favorite cheese, some manchego cheese, some bread. And I mean, like, I could drink vino de semana all day long. I could do
Yeah.
three of them, and but it was such a low barrier to entry, but nobody was on their phones and everybody was able to enjoy it. And if you didn't like it, you're like, okay, for €10, okay, we'll get the next one. But I hate to say it, but everything was great. I didn't have any complaints at all.
Yeah, exactly. I was in a nice restaurant, wasn't like a Michelin star, but a very, very nice restaurant. And I remember turning to the back of the menu, and they had a section, it was called something like wine for special occasions. And the most expensive bottle was $30. Nowadays in the US, you go out to a restaurant, you're lucky to find a bottle that's under $60. and and that's probably low in a lot of places.
And I think a lot of the problem with that probably comes into play is because, and I know this from, where we live in New Jersey, I'm close to some like kind of more poppin' towns as you might call them. But the rent is so high. The people have to pay the landlords. It's like they have no choice but to jack up the price. And it's sad
Yeah.
because I just said to my wife the other day, I went to a place the other day where I looked at from the outside. It was like, I don't know if I want to go into this place. I went inside and I had one of the best meals of my life. And I said, well, you know what? These guys are kind of on the outskirts in like a weird spot where they're probably not doing it. And guess what they focused on? The quality of the food and the quality of the drink. Something to be
Yeah.
said for that.
No question. That's why I said earlier with all the cyclical forces out there, I'm very, very sympathetic. Everybody is, hit by inflation, labor costs, everything getting more expensive. And so they're forced to premiumize. But unfortunately, it just has real consequences, like I was mentioning earlier.
Absolutely, absolutely. So the wine group produces like tens of millions of cases annually, and you guys manage dozens of brands. Running a portfolio that's that large is different than running a single winery. How do you think about portfolio strategy, and how do you kind of manage all of that?
Yeah, so we probably have over 100 brands, maybe close to 125. So obviously we can't focus on all of them. So we tend to, segment our portfolio by price point. So we sort of ladder most of our other than the brands that we sell direct to consumer through the tasting room operations that we own. We're really heavily concentrated under $20. And so we kind of ladder our portfolio priorities kind of from that low end, which starts with Franzia and kind of goes up to Mayomi at about $20. And so with that, I would say we probably focus on, probably 10 or so power brands, very, very large brands, kind of spanning that, call it $4 to $20 range. And then we tend to launch, a lot of new brands. We're heavy on innovation, trying to, as I mentioned, trying to attract that new consumer. And so on top of sort of those 10 priorities, we add a lot of, smaller type things. And that's always the constant struggle. It's both how can we execute more, which is tough, both internally and trying to, get more through our wholesalers and through our retailers. And then it's also a challenge to how do you sell the small things with the really big things, and then not
Yeah.
have that get lost in kind of the big sort of bureaucracy. So we really tend to, try to narrow down those 125 brands to really, call it 10 to 15 and really put outsized focus on that.
Because, like you said, I mean, you have to figure out which brands you're going to invest in, which ones you might retire. What makes a brand durable kind of year over year over year?
It has to obviously have a strong loyalty, strong track record, which by the way is very, very challenging and hard in the wine industry. There's very few brands that have strong loyalty. I can probably count them on my two hands. It's just for better or for worse, people like to try new things. And there's so many wine brands out there that, you can be lucky if somebody buys your brand, two, three, four times a year. They're always going to buy other things. So it's really kind of looking at those kind of household penetration statistics, looking at the velocity and the turns, looking at opportunities where you can get more distribution. And if you feel like at some point you've kind of maxed out at those sort of three things and can't really grow or increase them more, then the question comes, do you think you can maintain it where it is if the brand is still large? Because we have a lot of brands that let's say are down 8%.
Mhm.
If we can either maintain or slow a decline so it doesn't fall off a cliff, That's very valuable as well because you can make a lot of money, while continuing to sell those brands over a decade while they decline. But if you feel like you've hit a wall in those three sort of metrics, that's usually a signal a brand's going to decline fast. And then it's kind of time to move on from there and find something else to focus on.
Very true. Very true. So, your entry into the wine industry was through M&A. And, as you mentioned, the wine group has grown, through acquisitions and internal, innovation. Your company has been acquiring and revitalizing kind of established wine brands. What do you see in a lot of these opportunities that others might miss? How are you finding those diamonds in the rough out there to bring on for an acquisition to really push them forward and help them grow?
Yeah, so well, first of all, as we talked about right now, the industry is going through a challenging time. And I'm optimistic we're going to obviously come out of this better, but my belief, at least in a declining environment, you have to have size and scale to really strengthen your relationships with the wholesalers, with the retailers, and ultimately with the consumer. So part of our strategy has been to acquire large brands, even if they're in decline, and sort of add to our size and scale to help us sort of navigate through this challenging environment. And we do that really for a couple reasons. One, we're a very, very efficient operations company. And so a lot of times these large scale, we can get synergies out of them in terms of producing more efficiently and bringing down the costs. But also, even on the commercial side, we've had success in the past. Some of the brands you hope to turn around, but some you're realistic that at best maybe I can do is slow down those negative trends. But we've had really good success in sort of really looking into a brand's history, what made it successful at the beginning, what led to its growth, kind of studying what have they changed and caused it to veer off track, and then really bringing that brand back to its roots and trying to reattract the consumers that have left the brand. And so for us, I think a lot of companies shy away if something's either in decline, they say, hey, it's too complex. We're adding many SKUs. That just is or too many blends, those kind of things. And our organization has just learned to manage those things really, really well. So we've just kind of looked at a lot of those scale opportunities as real opportunities. And we like playing the role of a consolidator in a declining environment.
That's very, very cool. So, one thing that's really interesting to mention about the wine group is you're one of the very few large management owned wine companies. So, what I want to know is how does that ownership structure kind of influence the way that you run, the business? And then, my second question to that would be is why do a lot of public companies kind of struggle in this industry?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, we are management owned, and of course, I'm biased, but I believe it's been a real strategic advantage for us. And it's largely because I think it affords us the ability to always try to think long term. Now, I'll admit in this challenging environment and inflation and all of those things, it is hard at times to think long term when you're facing all the issues right in front of you. But
Yes.
in general, we try to approach everything with a long-term vision. We don't have to hit quarterly numbers. We don't have outside investors. sort of breathing down our necks. We are heavily debt financed, so really the people we answer to are our banks. But, as long as we're within our bank covenants, we really answer to ourselves and don't have a lot of sort of the typical outside constraints. And so we talk a lot, in our partnership agreement, it talks about being in a healthy financial condition, and that is much different than maximizing profits. And so don't get me wrong, we want to make lots of money and make profits, but as long as we are making good long-term decisions for the business in the long run, because we ultimately want to turn it over to the next generation of leaders and employees. We have no plans to go public or sell or anything like that. I think that way of thinking, that long-term thinking, along with sort of a lack of bureaucracy. We're Our chief marketing officer likes to say that our goal is to be the best big small company. And kind of what we mean by that is sort of taking the best parts of being a small company, which is trying to be fast in decision making, not have overly cumbersome processes, make decisions really quick, measured risk taking, all of those things, and mix them with the best things of a big company, which is size, scale, and resources. And I think when you combine those two things together, it kind of give us a big advantage. The second part of your question on why, public companies have had trouble succeeding is it's really two big reasons. One, the margins are fairly thin in wine, at least as you compare them to beer and spirits and kind of other CPG products. That number one is a challenge. But the number two, the harvest makes things every year is very, very unpredictable. So we talked a little bit earlier about how wine's kind of a natural product versus other categories that's more formula based. So beer and spirits, very, very predictable. You produce the same product the same way every single year. Whereas wine, if Mother Nature kind of challenges the grapes every year and you have a poor harvest, that's going to affect your financials. And Wall Street that typically has certain margin requirements, and they like predictability. And when your quarterly numbers bounce around a lot because of harvests and other factors, public companies have had a hard time kind of succeeding.
It makes a lot of sense. Before we wrap up, I just wanted to give you a couple rapid fire questions if you're good with that. So
Sure.
quick
Go for
answers, rapid fire. Let's go
it.
for it. So, what is your favorite wine region?
For me, it's probably Sonoma.
Sonoma. Got it. Wine you drink most often at home.
A brand called Chloe, which happens to be one of ours, but it's right in that $15 sweet spot we were talking about earlier.
All right, I'm going to have to pick up a bottle here. What's the most underrated wine category?
I would probably say the region of Paso Robles. Think they make fantastic wines at about that $20 price point.
Well, second to last one. Biggest myth about the wine industry.
So to me, I would say, going on the theme of earlier, it's really, I think there are great wines at all price points. It is like, I think there's a myth that you have to spend 20, $30 to get a good bottle of wine. Wine is like any other product, any other category. There are good products above $40. They're not so good products above $40, and they're very good products at 10 and below, and there's some not so good. Just like any other category. Find something you like at any price point and you'll be happy.
Okay. And then this one's just for me because you're a San Fran guy. Grateful Dead, yay or nay?
Nay. I've
Oh,
never been a Grateful
interesting.
Dead fan.
Interesting. 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 I like to ask all of our guests one question for our listeners, and it's I call it my $1,000,000 question. When you look back on your journey, personally and professionally, what is one moment that felt really small at the time, but ended up changing everything?
I would go back to the story I told earlier around, if there's something you really want, don't be afraid to ask because you never know the answer and you will regret it forever if you just didn't take that shot. So, always take your shot. The worst thing that can happen is somebody says no. And if they say no, you'll get over it fast. But if you don't even try, then you know the answer is no from not even trying, and you'll always regret it.
It's a great way to wrap this up. Thank you so much for joining me today, John. For the listeners, if you enjoyed the conversation, make sure you subscribe to Going Beyond the Deal so you never miss an episode. Share this episode with a friend or colleague or a founder who would appreciate the conversation. And if you're a business owner, executive, or an entrepreneur with a great story to tell, I'd love to hear from you. Then additionally, if you lead a founder-led or family-owned business and you're thinking about the next chapter, whether that means growth, acquisition, or a potential exit, I'm always happy to serve as a sounding board. Thank you for joining me and my new friend, John. I hope you have a wonderful day, and let's continue to build something meaningful together. Thank you, John.
Great. Thank you for having me. I really enjoyed it.
I enjoyed it as well. Take care, my friend.